In this video, we're going to begin our discussion of microbial diseases. Now, when we talk about microbial diseases, remember that this can occur anywhere on the body, and there are numerous diseases, more than we're going to be able to cover in this class, so we are going to limit the ones that we are going to cover, and I'm going to try to pick ones that are typical for a bacterial response, a viral response, protozoa, or even a fungus. And as we go through each of the diseases, I want you to pay attention to what's the causative agent, what are the factors that it uses to do harm or damage, what is that whole pathogenicity pathway. Remember the steps about the portal of entry and establishing itself, etc. Try to apply that as we talk about the diseases. And then look for those notable signs and symptoms that we discuss as well. Now, before we get to the actual diseases themselves, let's go through the major systems that are going to be impacted by the diseases that we are discussing for this unit. So first, let's talk about the skin. Obviously, and let's relate this back to the unit we just completed when we were talking about the immune protections and functions, and we talked about first and second, third lines of defense. Well, one of the major first lines of defense, if you recall, is the skin, because it's that largest organ. And how is the skin going to, under normal conditions, try to help us, protect us from those pathogens, okay, from getting an infection? Well, first, because of the amount of surface area it covers and that dry environment it provides, it is a physical, purely physical barrier. And as long as it stays intact, we're able to defend off most microbes, okay? Now, on top of the fact that it's a physical barrier, think about the fact that it has sweat glands, oil glands, so it's producing acids and enzymes as well, and those in of itself provide us a chemical barrier. And then on top of all of that, we have normal bacteria and microbes that live on our skin. And as long as the skin remains unbroken and those microbes are where they're supposed to be in their normal environment, then they actually help defend against other microbes coming in, establishing themselves. Now, depending on where you are in your body, that microbiota is going to alter in what exact microbes are present, okay? So those are all ways of which the skin, under normal conditions, are going to help us prevent pathogens from entering and infections occurring. So as we go through the diseases, you'll need to look to see how does it get past those normal barriers. And oftentimes with the skin, it's going to be due to the fact that we have breached that skin because you've cut yourself or something along those lines. Now, as you may recall as well, when we were talking about pathogenicity steps and we talked about having a preferred portal of entry and stuff, one of the main portals of entry is the respiratory tract. So obviously, if that's going to be the one that is being bombarded with pathogens all the time, let's recall what that respiratory tract does to protect us under normal circumstances. So we do talk about the fact that we have the upper respiratory and we have the lower respiratory kind of being separated there at that larynx region. So that upper respiratory, if you really look at it and you think about it, it's going to have those mucous membranes. It's going to have the cilia to move that mucous membrane between that nasal cavity and the throat areas. You're also going to have a lot of normal microbiota cells as well, and all of that's going to try to help us through moving that mucus in and out, those cellular motions, etc., even possibly initiating the cough reflex. All that is a way for that upper respiratory to help fight off those pathogens from entering our body. Now, if they get into the lower respiratory tract, then we also have other immune functions as well that are going to help down there. One of the biggest ones is having those alveolar macrophages, and that macrophages, as many of you will recall, being kind of one of those first cells that come in and try to help scan and get rid of microbes. We also are going to have a potent inflammatory response, which helps to, again, bring in more of those immune cells and, again, kind of help fight off pathogens. Now, you do recognize that one of the things that when we get respiratory infections, you notice how they all end in itis. So you have rhinitis or sinusitis, or you got pharyngitis and bronchitis and all that. That just means that it is going to have an inflammation. And that's because, as I said, you have a very strong inflammatory response, and that is to help us fight off that infection. Now we have the digestive system as well. And the digestive system, remember, this is going all the way from the mouth literally down to the large intestine and the colon and out. And it too, because we are putting foreign objects, if you will, into this system, and you think about it all the way from the mouth to the anus, it's actually still open to the environment. It's going to have lots of protection as well to try to keep those pathogens from entering. So all along that whole track, you're going to have a mucous membrane, which is going to be there to prevent microbes from getting in. It's going to help move things up and out as needed. It too has a normal set of microbes that live, and that too is going to vary depending on where you are in that digestive tract. And then, of course, we're going to have a huge number of chemicals, especially when you think about those stomach regions, and you're going to have all the acids and the digestive enzymes, and that's going to help prevent those pathogens from colonizing. It's going to even destroy some of them. And then there's a huge number of different kinds of immune cells in that MALT, okay, which is that mucus-associated lymphoid tissue of that digestive tract. So again, we have to have a huge number of protections there, because quite frequently in that digestive tract, because as we eat foods and stuff, we're constantly going to be challenging it with those foreign objects. And when you get some infection from a bacteria, or if the bacteria is secreting a toxin, that's what's leading to all that nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fevers. But believe it or not, all of those are, the more immediate they are, that's probably meaning the more pathogenic the microbe is. And those are all natural responses to help us flush that system and get rid of those microbes. So as unpleasant as they may be, really, when we get those foodborne illnesses and stuff, those responses are there to help protect us. Now let's talk a little bit about the circulatory system. So the circulatory system obviously is going to be that blood, okay, moving through the body. And its biggest contribution in all of the immune responses is going to be the transport that it provides, because it's going to be the system. So when we get an infection and all of a sudden a tissue gets damaged, and it sends out chemical signals to the rest of the body, if you remember those processes, to call those immune cells to the site of injury, well, they've got to get there somehow, and they're going to be using that circulatory system. So it's going to be its biggest defense mechanism is just bringing in those immune cells. Also think about it. In the plasma is of the blood is our antibodies, and then it's going to be bringing proteins for complement, for instance, and other chemicals that we might need to that site. And those chemicals are going to be helping with a fever and the inflammatory responses, and even in those responses, opening up and dilating those vessels and bringing the blood flow in is going to help us get those things, those needed for the responses, but also help us to clear away those pathogens as well. So the bloodstream is going to be moving, and it's going to help us to rapidly bring that what is needed to the site to get rid of it. And unfortunately, it can also, if we get the infection in the blood, it can then carry it through the body as well. So because it has such potent ability to move that pathogen, it also has to have protective functions as well. And then the last one that we're going to discuss is the nervous system. And the nervous system is obviously the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And you will find as we're discussing the diseases, we're not going to have as many diseases of the nervous system, especially of that central nervous system. And why? Because it is highly protective, especially because of it's got a lot of cells, especially those glial cells that are going to go in and protect those the peripheral and the central nervous systems by wrapping those tissues. And then if you're talking about the central nervous system, especially the brain, you've all heard of the blood-brain barrier, and that too excludes majority, 99% of microbes plus. So very few can get past it, and when they do, they're going to be generally pretty pathogenic in nature. But when we do get them, they will initiate the inflammatory responses, and that's why you see encephalitis and meningitis and things along like that. Again, that itis term meaning that it's an inflammation. So between the meninges and the cells and the blood-brain barriers, the nervous system too is doing everything it can to prevent pathogens from getting in. Now, when we start discussing our diseases in the next couple of videos, we're going to break them down based upon the type of pathogen. So we're going to talk about bacterial diseases, and as you can see, this is on the right hand side over here. This is the list of diseases that we're going to discuss that are bacterial related. So just some general notes on bacterial diseases. Recognize that they can affect all areas of the body, and we're not covering all areas because, again, as mentioned earlier, we're not able to cover all diseases. So we're going to do some typical ones and ones that you will encounter quite frequently in some cases in the healthcare field, and then others which you may not ever occur in your lifetime as a healthcare provider, but either you've heard of or they've got some significance that I want you to remember and learn about them. So each bacterial infection, as we go through it, it's going to be very different in how it behaves. So you will need to pay attention to those virulence factors. So is it a toxin that it's releasing? Is it an enzyme that it's using? Does it have special adhesion molecules, etc.? Then you need to also realize that how is it using or how are we using as a host those defense mechanisms that we just talked about between the various systems to help us fight against this. So again, it's going to be looking at that whole process of how does that pathogen, that bacteria, fight against host defense mechanisms to break those down and then cause that infection. We're going to look at viral diseases as well, and you can see this list is much shorter, but we've got those very prominent viruses that you're so used to between influenza, chickenpox, hepatitis, etc. And again, you're going to be looking for those virulence factors that are going to be those cellular mechanisms, especially because remember, the main difference between viral infections and bacterial infections is going to be where the two pathogens have to go in order to survive. So in the case of bacteria, they're extracellular. They don't need to get inside the host cell's systems. Whereas viruses, in order to be able to replicate, they do have to invade. So they're intracellular pathogens and parasites. And so you're going to often see that these are going to invoke those T cytotoxic or cell-mediated responses. So look for those. We are going to discuss two different parasitic diseases. They are not as common here in as they would be in third world countries, but again, they're good to learn because we do have some around, and they're good to understand not only how pathogens operate but also how our host defense mechanisms. Now, we're only going to do two because when you look at those parasitic diseases, what you're going to realize in most cases is that they're going to have a host. They're going to be very complicated in their mechanisms. They may not be easy to get rid of at all. And so they're often, again, their life cycles are going to be very complex. So you're going to have to really look at what is their normal active state? Do they have a latent state? What is their transmission? What's carrying them? Do they require a vector? So when we get to those parasitic diseases, look for all the different pieces. And then we'll talk about one fungal diseases, and of course that's going to be like thrush and things like that comes from a yeast infection. And it's going to be very different, especially when we talk about those treatments, because remember, out of all of them, with the parasites and the fungus, these are often eukaryotic cells, and so therefore they're going to have similarities to the host, so we have to treat them very different. So again, that's what we're going to cover in this chapter. Start reading the textbook on it, and then just start looking for those various videos to be posted as we work through the bacteria, viruses, fungus, and the parasitic diseases.